Hello, welcome to part 11 of The Rise of Political Parties. We're going to take a quick look at John Marshall's Supreme Court. Now, John Marshall is going to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for a long time. As I've mentioned before, he'll be appointed in January of 1801 by President John Adams, and he'll remain in that court until his death in 1835, right? So for 34 years, he is going to be a Federalist Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and many of his decisions are going to have an impact on how America operates even to this day. So there are 5 pivotal cases we're going to take a quick look at here, and collectively across this course, we're going to look at 8 different court cases that he presided over. The first one's pretty important, Marbury versus Madison. It's from Marbury versus Madison of 1803 that we come up with the precedent of judicial review. Remember, the Constitution does not say who determines constitutionality of law. That's why you had, for example, those Kentucky resolutions by Thomas Jefferson during the Adams administration said maybe states can do it, right? Now, if you remember, I've talked about this before. John Marshall was Secretary of State there at the end of Adams's term during the Midnight Judges Act, and he left a stack of unsent appointments. Unsent appointments that included one to a man named William Marbury. William Marbury is going to find out that he had an appointment signed by the president, but it was never sent by the new Secretary of State, James Madison, because Jefferson had told him, throw him out, I'm reversing all of these anyways. Marbury sues. He sues directly with the Supreme Court of the United States, saying, hey, it didn't matter that the administration's changed, that a signed commission by the President of the United States, it is the responsibility of the Secretary of State to send these, right? That James Madison had violated the law by doing so. He has the responsibility to execute his office, okay? Now, ultimately in this case, John Marshall will agree with William Marbury. He says, you are correct that the change in administration makes no difference and that James Madison did have a responsibility to send these out. But he goes on, he goes, however, Mr. Marbury, you lose. Why? Because the Supreme Court of the United States is an appellate court. We are not an originator of law. In other words, you filed your case with the wrong court. You needed to file it in a lower court, and it could only be appealed to us. And from that, he extends on that in his decision, where he establishes the idea that the U.S. Supreme Court's responsibility is that of judicial review to determine constitutionality. That's how it is exercised today. That's the main function that we see it do today. But it actually is nowhere in the Constitution. It's actually established by the legal precedent of Marbury versus Madison. Next one, Fletcher versus Peck, 1810. This is going to surround federal supremacy. Okay. Basically, it's going to the question that's going to come up in this is that is a state Supreme Court of a higher authority than a lower federal court, right? Because the supremacy clause of the Constitution says federal court or federal law trumps state law, right? But the question is where is that dividing line? Is a state Supreme Court more superior than a low federal court? Marshall says no, right? In Fletcher versus Peck, federal supremacy reigns. It could be, and I'm going to make a court up, a federal traffic court, if that existed. I don't think one does. Has more authority than the Supreme Court of the state of Texas, for example. Mcculloch versus Maryland. This is another very important one, 1819, implied powers. This is going to surround the Bank of the United States. The charter for the first Bank of the United States had expired. A new one it expired in 1811. A second Bank of the United States will be established by 1816 and will immediately be challenged in the court. Just a lot of controversy about this national bank thing, right? The state of Maryland is going to decide that what they'll do is they will just tax the land in which the Bank of the United States resides upon and basically make it impossible for the federal government to have a bank there, okay? A lawsuit ensues that goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay. In this lawsuit, it is determined that, first of all, the state of Maryland cannot tax federal land, right? land being possessed by the federal government. And two, it establishes the interpretation of the Constitution. Remember that National Bank was all about whether the Constitution is to be determined, interpreted narrowly or broadly. And in Mcculloch versus Maryland, the idea of implied powers, that in broad interpretation is going to win the day. Next, we have Gibbons versus Ogden. This has to do with the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, it's also the same place where your necessary and proper clause is, right? Despite the fact that we have a constitutional United States of America, you still have states charging tariffs on each other, right? You have interstate trade wars. The Commerce Clause in this, what happens is the Marshall Court in 1824 determines that interstate commerce is the jurisdiction of the federal government and states cannot interfere with that. So the moment something crosses state lines, it becomes a federal issue. This is true in commercial transactions. It's also true in legal transactions. That's why, for example, if you steal a car and drive around locally, you've committed theft. But if you steal a car and you drive it to Oklahoma, you've now committed grand theft auto, right? The last one here is Barron versus Baltimore. This is just an example I put in here to give you an idea that just because the Marshall Court set all these precedents that still affect us today, they weren't always right. They weren't always good. In Barron versus Baltimore, it had to do, this is 1833, it had to do with the Bill of Rights. And in it, it stated that the Bill of Rights only applied to the government. In other words, that the individual, those natural rights listed in the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual. An individual cannot violate your First Amendment rights, for example, because the Bill of Rights only restricts what the federal government can do. The reason why that's important is that, first of all, that has never been overturned. It still technically can be used as legal precedents today. It will be used as legal precedents in a court case that will follow after the Civil War, after the results of after the conviction of the Colfax massacre, right, called Cruikshanks versus the United States, where the head of the riot that killed over 150 African Americans were let go because they said they were convicted under the grounds of violating their 14th Amendment rights, and because of Barron versus Baltimore, it was determined, hey, they're individuals. They can't violate your constitutional rights. All right, so the Marshall Court does all these things, but they're not always correct. It's not a perfect system. But many of Marshall's cases do still stand as the standard bearer of the American system today.